There is a mountain range in the Balkans where the names have not changed in a way that should be impossible. Not the language, not the customs. The names themselves, carried from household to household, valley to valley, for longer than most nations have existed. And when geneticists finally sat down to trace where those names came from, they did not find a simple answer. They found something that unsettled the tidy story Europe had told about itself for 2 centuries. For a long time, the Albanian people were treated as a footnote in the larger drama of European history. A small nation, wedged between empires, absorbed into whichever power happened to be passing through, Roman, Byzantine, Slavic, Ottoman. Historians assumed their surnames, like most European surnames, were relatively recent inventions, shaped mostly by medieval feudal record-keeping and religious conversion. A tidy, forgettable detail in a much larger story. Then the DNA arrived. And the story stopped being tidy. What researchers began to notice, when they compared certain Albanian paternal lineages against the broader European genetic map, was a pattern that did not behave the way it was supposed to. Some of the oldest surnames in the Highlands were not just old in the cultural sense. The men carrying them appeared to share deep, uninterrupted genetic threads stretching back thousands of years, threads that predated the Roman Empire, predated the Slavic migrations, predated almost every event historians had used to explain who the Albanians were. This is not a story about proving a nation is pure. Human populations are never pure. That idea belongs to 19th century politics, not to genetics. This is a story about something stranger and more interesting. A population that may have preserved an unusually intact genetic memory, hiding in plain sight, encoded not in monuments or manuscripts, but in surnames passed quietly down mountain valleys for 100 generations. For most of modern history, the accepted explanation for Albanian origins was straightforward, even elegant. Linguists had long argued that Albanian is one of the oldest surviving branches of the Indo-European language family, likely descending from ancient Illyrian, Thracian, or a closely related tongue spoken in the Western Balkans before Rome ever arrived. Archaeologists filled in the rest. Illyrian tribes, Roman conquest, centuries of Byzantine rule, waves of Slavic settlement in the early medieval period, and finally, 500 years under the Ottoman Empire. Under this framework, Albania these traditions were. Families did not simply claim ancient descent in a vague, symbolic way. They claimed it with precision. This valley, this ridge, this surname, going back to a named ancestor believed to have settled the land long before any outside record could confirm it. Historians treated this the way they treated most oral traditions. Interesting but unreliable. Myth dressed up as memory. That was the first crack. Not a contradiction yet, just a quiet mismatch between what the paper record suggested and what the people themselves insisted was true. Then genetics entered the conversation, and the mismatch became something else entirely. To understand what changed, it helps to understand what kind of DNA evidence we are talking about. Autosomal DNA, the kind inherited from both parents, is extraordinarily useful for understanding broad ancestry, but it gets reshuffled every generation, blending and blurring over time. For tracing a single, unbroken male lineage across centuries, researchers instead turned to the Y chromosome, passed almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, carrying with it small mutations that act like a slow-ticking clock. When population geneticists studying the Balkans began sequencing Y chromosome data from Albanian men, cross-referencing it, where possible, against known surname groups from isolated highland clans, they expected to see the same fragmented, mixed picture found almost everywhere else in post-Ottoman Europe. A patchwork of lineages arriving at different times, from different directions, blended by centuries of migration and conquest. That is not entirely what the data suggested. Instead, certain highland lineages tied to specific old surnames showed an unusually deep, unusually continuous genetic signature, one that researchers have cautiously linked to ancient Balkan populations that predate not only the Ottoman period, but the Slavic migrations of the 6th and 7th centuries, and in some interpretations, populations connected to the pre-Roman Illyrian world itself. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where a name, a mountain, and a strand of DNA start pulling on threads historians never expected to move, consider subscribing. There is far more hidden in the human past than most of us realize. The deeper researchers looked, the more the picture complicated rather than clarified. This is worth sitting with, because it is where the real story lives, not in a single dramatic reveal, but in the layering. Some highland lineages did show clear signs of later admixture, consistent with Slavic-era settlement, exactly as the old model predicted. Others showed genetic affinities pointing toward the wider Mediterranean and Anatolian world, consistent with millennia of trade, conquest, and contact across the Adriatic. But a smaller number of lineages, concentrated in specific, historically isolated clans, showed something researchers describe more cautiously: a genetic depth and continuity that does not fit neatly into any single migration event historians had already mapped. The evidence does not prove an unbroken line back to the Illyrians. Ancient DNA from the pre-Roman Balkans remains limited, and comparing modern Y chromosome lineages to ancient ones is a careful, uncertain science, one where researchers are right to remain cautious about overclaiming. What the data does suggest, in the words of several researchers working in this space, is that some highland Albanian lineages may represent one of the least disturbed genetic threads remaining from the deep pre-Slavic population of the Western Balkans. That is a very different claim than "the Albanians are the last pure Illyrians," a phrase that has circulated in nationalist rhetoric for decades and that serious geneticists are careful to avoid. Population history is never that clean. But it is also a far more interesting claim than the old assumption that Albanian ancestry was simply a late medieval blend shaped by imperial administration. At this point, three explanatory frameworks emerged among researchers trying to make sense of the pattern. The first is geographic isolation as genetic preservation, the idea that the sheer difficulty of the terrain kept certain highland clans functionally cut off from the larger migrations reshaping the lowlands, allowing older lineages to survive largely undiluted for far longer than anywhere else in the region. The second is what geneticists sometimes call a founder effect combined with clan endogamy, meaning that specific highland communities, organized for centuries around strict clan and surname loyalty, tended to marry within a narrow network of related families, which would naturally preserve and concentrate older genetic signatures rather than dispersing them. The third, more speculative framework suggests the possibility of a deeper connection to what researchers term a Balkan ghost population, an ancient genetic layer known from ancient DNA studies elsewhere in southeastern Europe but not yet fully sampled in the highlands themselves, meaning the full picture may still be missing pieces no one has recovered yet. None of these explanations cancel each other out. It is entirely possible, even likely, that all three were working together, reinforcing one another across centuries of near-total isolation. The turning point in this research did not come from a single dramatic discovery, but from something more methodical, broader comparison panels. Earlier genetic studies of the Balkans often worked with small, scattered samples, comparing a handful of Albanian participants against equally limited datasets from surrounding countries. As sample sizes grew, and as researchers began cross-referencing modern Y chromosome data against a wider pool of ancient DNA recovered from Bronze Age and Iron Age burial sites across the Balkans, the picture sharpened. What emerged was not a single clean lineage stretching unbroken from antiquity to the present. It was something closer to layered sediment, older genetic strata still visible beneath centuries of later arrivals, preserved most clearly in exactly the places history had least disturbed, the mountains. And this is where the twist becomes difficult to ignore. Researchers expected, if anything unusual turned up, that it would connect Albanian highland lineages most closely to neighboring Balkan populations, Slavic-speaking groups nearby, or perhaps Greek populations to the south. Instead, some of the deepest, oldest signals showed their closest affinities not with immediate neighbors, but with much older, more geographically dispersed pre-Indo-European and early Indo-European strata found in ancient samples from across the wider Balkan and Adriatic corridor, a signature more connected to deep time than to any single modern nation. Not the population expected. Not even the region expected. The genome, in other words, was not confirming the old story. It was not simply saying yes, the Illyrians survived. It was suggesting something more unsettling and more beautiful, that the highland clans of northern Albania may be carrying forward genetic fragments of a Balkan world that existed before Albanian, before Slavic, before most of the ethnic categories we now treat as ancient and fixed. The surname was never just a name. It may have been, without anyone fully realizing it, a genealogical seal on something the rest of Europe lost. Why does this matter beyond one small nation in the Balkans? Because it is a reminder that the neat ethnic boxes modern nations use to describe themselves, Slavic, Latin, Germanic, Illyrian, are far younger and far leakier than they appear. Populations were never sealed containers. They moved, mixed, retreated into mountains, intermarried within tight clan networks, and occasionally, in rare and specific circumstances, preserved deep threads of ancestry that the rest of a continent had long since diluted or erased. Human history is not a family tree with clean branches. It is closer to a river system, streams merging, splitting, disappearing underground for centuries, and sometimes resurfacing somewhere no one expected, carrying sediment from a source everyone assumed was long gone. Picture the terrain itself for a moment. The accursed mountains of northern Albania, a name earned honestly, jagged limestone peaks, narrow passes, valleys that flood with fog by mid-morning and clear into a hard, silver light by afternoon. Stone towers built for defense still stand in some villages, relics of a clan-based justice system that operated for centuries with only minimal interference from whichever empire technically claimed the land. Shepherds still move flocks along paths their grandfathers' used, paths that predate any border ever drawn on a map. It is not difficult to imagine why a lineage might survive here when it could not survive on the open plains further east, where every century brought a new army, a new administration, a new wave of settlement pressing against the old population until it blended into something else. The mountains did not preserve a myth. They may have preserved a genome. None of this offers final certainty, and it should not be presented as if it does. Ancient DNA recovery in the Balkans is still incomplete. Surname-based genetic studies, however carefully designed, cannot perfectly separate biological ancestry from centuries of adoption, intermarriage across clan lines, and the ordinary messiness of human life. Researchers studying this region are, rightly, cautious people. They speak in terms of signals, patterns, and probabilities, not proclamations. But even with that caution intact, something real has shifted. The old assumption that Albanian surnames were simply a late medieval overlay, administratively assigned and historically shallow, no longer holds up cleanly against the genetic evidence. Something older is embedded in at least some of these names. Something that predates the empires that thought they had absorbed this land completely. If there is a lesson buried in this story, it is not really about Albania at all. It is about how much of the deep human past survives quietly, in places too remote or too stubborn to be fully rewritten, not preserved in a museum, not recorded in an official archive, but carried unknowingly inside ordinary families, Inside names spoken at baptisms and funerals for 1,000 years without anyone realizing what those names were actually holding. The old map called this region a footnote. The genome suggests it may be closer to a footnote in the wrong story, a fragment of a much older narrative that the rest of Europe stopped being able to read centuries ago. The mystery has not been solved. It has widened. And somewhere in those mountains, a name is still being passed from father to son, carrying, perhaps, something far older than anyone ever intended it to hold. If stories like this move you, where a single name becomes a doorway into thousands of years of forgotten human history, subscribe and stay close. The past is not finished revealing itself.